Okay, so let's start. I can't see anything, but let's say it's fine. So it's my pleasure to welcome Auxane Boch, if I say it right, for talk today. I have some note. Wait a minute. Yes, okay. So let's start. So it's my pleasure to welcome Auxane Boch from TUM, the Technological University of Munich. Auxane is a research associate and a doctoral candidate at TUM, more specifically in the Institute for Ethics in AI. She is specialized in civil psychology domain, which she has done a master, and she's focusing on interactive technology ethics, especially applied on social robots and video games. And she's also very involved in women in game. She's a women game and very involved in women in tech. So she's going to speak today about this topic, about games and lots of other things about our research that is leading now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So hi everyone, I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Hopefully it works. Yeah, I think it works fine. So today we're gonna speak about video games ethics. And the presentation is named Game Changers, Leveling Up Video Game Ethics. The main idea came, well, most of the work I'm going to present here is kind of a summary of a book chapter that we've written with some friends and also paper on video games ethics, because we figured that it's starting to be a conversation, but it's not really a conversation yet. And so my co-authors on this are Bethany Thomas, that's also a cyber psychology specialist. She's doing her PhD at Edge Hill University. Vanessa Wanek, who's a video game professor, so she's more in the technical and design aspect of video game at Southampton University, and Casey Clifford, that is an MIT alumni, if I'm right, and that still works in esports very much. So we try to have a lot of different perspective when writing this, not just academic or not just philosophical in a way, but rather very applied and very psychology oriented. So what we're going to talk about today is mostly about the psychology of games and how that relates to AI ethics, to video games ethics, sorry. All right. So first, I mean, Thierry presented me already, but I'm a doctoral candidate at the Technical University of Munich, research associate in AI ethics. And indeed, I have a background in psychology, specifically cyber psychology, which is the interaction between machines and technology. And actually, I did my master's thesis on video game psychology, which is where it all started in a way. I also do other stuff. And for this, the most relevant is that I'm an ambassador for women in games. The little QR code that you'll see also on the last slide is my personal website. So let's start with games. What are they? Well, first of all, they are interactive electronic games played on screens, commonly through game consoles, computers, and mobile devices. So the historical roots is in the 50s. That's when it started with Tennis for Two and Spacewell. Those are two that you can see on the screen on the left. And then we had a popularity surge based on this in the 70s and 80s with Pac-Man. And I'm pretty sure all of you have played Pac-Man, or at least I kind of hope all of you have played Pac-Man. It's a fantastic game. And thanks, Alejandro, for interacting. I love this. Please feel free to speak with me through the chat. I have it under my eyes. And continuous evolution is now that we started with those screens that you see on the left, right? And now we have what we call AAA video games that are fantastic, that are such a real environment, sometimes open environments, that you can go around and figure out cultures, figure out different things, meet people or virtual people. And that is just fantastic. So we're going to talk about that right now, that today we have about 35% of our world population that is a gamer. And it starts with Candy Crush. So I think everyone, or I hope also everyone already had played the video games, but video games don't have to be those big open world. They can simply be your phone games. So that means we have 35% of the world populations that's a gamer. And the most known game would be Minecraft. So that's the one people interact with the most through YouTube videos, for example, 1 trillion in 2023. But also gamers, so amount of account, registered account would be the highest for Candy Crush in 2022. And I guess they're gonna keep that place for a little while because I know a lot of people play Candy Crush Saga. So that asks a question. We have so many people in this world that are playing video games. And at this stage, I'm aware of small activities towards video game ethics. And we know that they might have impact. So today what we're going to see is which impact they can have, because that's where ethics start. If you want to do things the right way, you already need to understand what are the risks and what are the opportunities. So let's deep dive into what is video game ethics for a minute. It is exploring the impact of games on individuals and societies through philosophical and empirical approaches. It is evolving with societal values, which means that our ethics in the West might not be the same as in the East. It might not be the same from one country to another, one region to another. It depends on societal values. That's a very important point. So the perspective we're taking here is very much an empirical perspective, which does not mean that what we say stands everywhere. Also, stakeholders' perspectives, so anyone involved in making the game, playing the game, selling the game, they vary. And that also makes everything a bit more complex. And in general, we've seen that the industry is having a surge of interest in the importance of ethical considerations. So that's something good. We've seen a lot of conferences pop up lately, like Games for Good, that aims at discussing those topics a bit more. So we like that. Okay, now we deep dive into the actual topic. We're going to start with the cognitive side of the story. That's very much about understanding what we know about the impact of games on individual, on their cognitive abilities, whether it is traditional cognitive abilities or social cognitive abilities. We'll see what I mean in a minute. So first step, cognitive skills in gaming. First thing to understand is that video games are different one to another based on two major things, game mechanics and game genres. That's the way we will categorize them. Game mechanics are basically the rules and design elements that shape a game and that create how you're going to play it. Two examples that I wanted to put in here are resource management games such as Stardew Valley, where you're a farmer, and so you have to manage your crops, your animals, and card-based and deck building in Hearthstone. So that would be literally getting some cards, figuring out how to have the best combination of creatures, potions, whatever, to win a card game, but virtually. That would be strategic as well. So those are the different mechanics. You also have turn-based mechanics where one person after another will play, and so on. You also have game genres, and those are more about the themes, the mechanics and the themes of the game. So two examples that I put down is adventure games, because a lot of people are aware of adventure games usually. And that would be, for example, Uncharted, where you have to follow quests and you have, anyway, you're in a very adventurous world and you have to make a lot of decisions. There's a lot of exploration happening as well. And then you have strategy games as well, which are a good example with Civilization. The Last of Us, very good example of an adventure game as well. And so strategy games like Civilization, where basically you have turn-based to lead your civilization to success. And you can decide if you do it through diplomacy, warfare, culture, but you know what I mean. So those are two different things. One is the mechanics within the games, and the other one is the genre, so the general approach to this. Yes, Zelda is very complete. That's very true. So now, how do those impact our cognitive skills? I'm not going to review all the types of cognitive skills in the book, but I'm going to mention some that I'm sure you're very aware of. According to a review in 2021, we, by playing games, have the potential to train some of our skills. This is something that has been confirmed already before, or in a way, this review confirms what has already been found. And some of those skills that can be pointed out are problem solving, time management, learning, general cognition. And this is awesome. So maybe some of you know the Dr. Layton, Professor Layton, I'm never too sure, puzzle games or any type of puzzle games. This actually trains your problem solving. And time management is a big one, especially when you look at games such as Detroit Become Human. That's a narrative video game. So that means a lot of the decision making you do will impact the narrative of the game itself. This will impact, therefore, your time management by playing it, because you have to take quick decisions. And by training yourself to make quick decisions that will have an impact, you just learn a new skill, or you reinforce a new skill. And those skills, they can be used in real life, but we'll get back to that. You also have about action games, Uncharted again, that's one that has been very much studied. A question of attention. Attention is also a cognitive skill, and attention control and learning has been seen to be impacted by action games, action video games that are a bit complex, that have a bit more, just like Zelda, than simply one game mechanics, but maybe have more than that and make you kind of stay on your toes. And we also see that when learning a new language, playing video games actually heighten your attention skill, because it adds it asks the same brain areas than in real life learning to be available during this task. So you can learn a language while playing video games, and I think that's very cool. So we see that in general, we can learn a lot of things, cognitively speaking, through playing video games. I'll read the questions right at the end of this subpart. And all of those skills, they can be translated to other areas, and that is quite awesome. So in general, when we talk about cognitive skill, video games have a positive effect, or they can have a positive effect on cognitive skills, and it can translate into a lot of areas of your life. And game mechanics are very important. That's more assigned for developers to say, hey, look at your game mechanics, because they play a big role in building skills. All right, let's look at the questions. Did you observe some cultural or social differences on the way people behave during a gameplay? Not to my knowledge, but that is definitely something to look into. And in general, do you have many metrics to measure ethics in games? Not yet, but we're working on it. And actually, after this presentation, I do hope you can evaluate some stuff. Yes, Maya, the cognitive skills in gaming can be translated in scholar learning. Okay, let's move on to the second part. So social cognition and multiplayer games. So as I told you, cognitive skills are not just one set of skills. You also have a social cognition aspect. And we'll see already what social cognition means. And here you have to keep in mind that we're talking about multiplayer games. So rather being with someone next to you and play, or online interacting with people in the virtual world and play. Social cognition is the way we think about and understand the social world around us. It's been defined initially as the way we think about people, and later on, it has been a bit more described as a branch of cognitive psychology that focuses on how we perceive, which is a cognitive skill, interpret and process social information. All of those involve cognition and cognitive skills. This is why it is called social cognition. So perceive, interpret, and process social cognition. This includes, for example, recognizing social cues. I'm waving at you. This is social cue. This is saying hi. Forming opinions about others' behavior and understanding their thoughts and feelings, or at least being able to perceive them, to process them in a certain way. And this relates closely to empathy, which in a way is a social cognition skill. So social cognition, as you see, is very, very important. It's going to impact our ability to interact with the world and to successfully have relationships and interactions in an appropriate way. That's very important as well, is you're not going to behave the same way when you're at home than when you're at work or when you're at school. And that's very normal because we need to be appropriate in our setting. And I'm not going to go deep into social psychology here, but if you're interested, you can look up social roles and social norms, and those will be a few key points that you can look into to see how this changes. So social cognition is very, very important. And how does that impact, or how is that impacted rather, by our multiplayer ability? So when we're playing in multiplayer games, we have social interactions, whether in real life, whether through a screen. I don't really like saying in real life usually, so let's say online, offline, because video games are real life. So multiplayer games involve social interaction that serve the purpose of collaboration or competition. And this is a very important point, collaboration or competition, because that's also very true in our general interactions. We have both. So cooperation is actually mostly a motivation to play for young adults, according to a study of 2009, where they surveyed young adults. And their main motivations were therefore the social interaction, so the positive social interaction, including cooperation and communication, to play multiplayer games. Now, there's also a big ethical question, if we can say, or controversy, that is about the idea of competition that might have negative impact on real life behavior of gamers. And this is still debated. This is very much debated because we have in-lab data from 2011, for example, that would tell us that indeed we have a negative impact of competition on self-reported behavior of gamers. But in field research from 2020, which means real life data collection, in field research observing real life behavior, actually this did not conclude the same way. The answers from MacLean and collaborators is rather that it doesn't really impact it. But, you know, that also means we're unsure yet. We would need much more studies to fully confirm, fully infirm anything, but probably the in-lab versus offline actually had an impact. So we've also checked a lot of types of benefits that collaboration in multiplayer games could have. And not just about, so yeah, it's still about collaboration and competition, but just in general as well. And here are a few names of different games that you can look into. They're very cute. Super Word Search is very much a crossword situation. And Emotion Detective is just a very cute game. I would definitely recommend to look into it, especially if you have children or you're playing with children. So Super Word Search showed to actually increase teamwork and social skills in children, the development of coping strategies for children. So that means instead of riling up and being very frustrated, figuring out a way to be socially adapted in the way you're coping with the situation. And mutual support. Those who are in classroom experiment, that means the children were next to each other in person. A study on Emotion Detective also showed some very positive impacts, such as social emotional knowledge building and empathy abilities through collaborative gameplays. And finally, collaborative and teamwork games in general have been studied with esports competitors, and this showed to heighten their communication skill. I think when I say all of those, I hope most of you would say, yeah, that makes sense. Because in general, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. And I see a typo, sorry about that. Impact on the offline world. So how does that translate? Well, it has been seen to translate into having an impact on the proactivity of helping others, and massive multiplayer online role-playing games, very long name from MMORPGs, are also very much linked to learning a new language because of the collaborative aspect of the game. So language will be mentioned quite a few more times, I think, in this presentation, because there's a lot of research on how to teach language appropriately, and so that was an easy one to go for. So now we have an idea that, okay, from the cognitive aspect of things, we can see that video games do have an impact on cognitive skills, and it seems to be mostly positive, even though for social skills, we're wondering if competition might have a negative impact. We have both sides of the story discussing it. I see there's a lot of questions. So maybe, Thierry, if you want, we can take 5 minutes now to answer a few before we move on to the second part about mental health. Oh, you're muted, Thierry.
Sorry. There's a microphone close on microphone. So, yes, we can take some questions, and there are some in the chat as well.
Okay, so I see a question from Petra. Do you have any metrics to measure ethics in games? I think I already said that earlier. I already answered it saying, for now, not 100%, but I think you're going to see some things by the end of this presentation that we can measure by research. Do cognitive skills from Maya, do cognitive skills in gaming can be translated in scholar learning? It's written leasing, but I guess you meant learning. Yes, definitely. Games like Minecraft, League of Legends or Fortnite are free-to-play games, allowing users to buy. We're getting to that right after, so I am not going to talk about it right now. No doubt a lot of kids are addicted to these games. Again, we're going to that right after. How can we measure the transpositions of skills? So there are experimental methodologies that have been tested and validated, of course, Maya. I would say you can definitely go look into the bibliography that I've put in the slides and see the methodologies they've used. There are quite a few, for example, having people play and then observing behavior. So for example, for the helping behavior, the prosocial behavior, I think they made people play, or children play games for a little while, and then a person that was working with the researchers acted like they would need help. And then they were evaluating if proactively the children would help them or not. I know you can also do the best type of data collection, I would say, is probably observational. So when you do not interact with the environment, but rather you see what happens. And so in this case, ideally, you would have a look over a classroom for, when it comes to children research, of course, over a classroom for days or something, and see if after playing specific games, they had a different behavior. This is very hard to do. This is the kind of research that ethically, but also just technically is very, very resource demanding, and so very hard to do. But there are quite a few ways. Self-reported measures is also one. So when you ask people question in an experimental setting today, I would say that's the most we use because it's less resource costing. Okay.
I have just a question, short question. Very general. What is ethics in games context? Because I mean, it can be addiction, but it can be also the way things are presented in the game. So it can be a bit everything, I guess. Is there a typology of programs or something?
So ethics in games is mostly the ethics surrounding the game, but also within the game. So it will inform decision making for developers on what to put in their game or not, or what to ideally put in their game, but also who should play which games. I think a very simple one that everyone knows is the age for games. So if we say this game shouldn't be played by someone under 12, usually there is a reason, and it's an ethical reason. That is, we do not want to harm someone or a child. So in this approach that is very descriptive, we're doing a very descriptive, empirical-based type of ethics here. That would be limiting the risks and improving the opportunities.
Okay.
Does that answer?
Yes.
Awesome. So now let's talk about mental health discussions. And this is the part where I know a lot of people will have a lot of opinions, and that's fine. You're entitled to your opinions. All I'm doing here is presenting data. So from cognitive to mental health discussions, we're going to start with loop boxes and dark patterns, because that's a very good kind of entry point, and that relates to Zach and your question. Loot boxes and dark patterns. First, what are loot boxes? Loot boxes are a mechanics in game that is basically a gacha mechanic where players spend money or in-game currency for a chance to get a random reward. The random is very important, which can be rare and unobtained through other means. For example, in Animal Crossing, you have Pocket Camps fortune cookies. So you can see them on the left. For example, this fortune cookie was Apollo's cinema cookie. And that allows you, I think, to access the cinema. And in League of Legends, that would be Hextech Chest. Most of the loot boxes would be for aesthetic purposes or specific objects. Sometimes it's specific skills, but yeah. Now, different from pay to win. Very important, because as much as you can spend money to have a random reward, keep in mind it is random. Also, loot boxes have their own loop, which is like a Skinner box. They're going to redo the same thing to get a random reward that might be good, might not, ongoingly, with a different timing than the rules of the game. And that's important, again, because that makes it different from pay to win. Pay to win being you give money to the game to unlock specific abilities or, how do you say that? Sorry, weapons, for example. And this will allow you to then be better than others, level up quicker maybe, and therefore win. Loot boxes is random or are random, therefore it's different, and it does not fit within the timeline of the game in a way. It's very also unrelated to the timeline of the game. Players repeat activities to receive rewards. That's the part that gets a bit tricky, because then you will repeat the same behavior to receive loot boxes that therefore will be random and might give or give you not something good for your gameplay. Sometimes it's high stakes, sometimes it's low stake, but that's a different discussion. Now, there has been a study on Steam platform about loot boxes and cosmetic microtransactions, and it has been seen that it has grown exponentially with a peak in 2019 with at least 70% of gamers playing games with loot boxes. That does not mean that they would actually take the loot boxes or play for the loot boxes or even enter that game mechanics. But that does mean that they have the opportunity to, they're exposed to this gacha mechanic. Okay, I hope I'm clear about what loot boxes are. Now, what is the dark pattern? And what is kind of what's behind this question of dark pattern? That here we're going to talk about the theory of ego depletion. Dark patterns are strategies causing negative experience without explicit consent. If it's also used, for example, for website, when you want to unsubscribe, for example, to a newsletter or to a website or something, sometimes it's very hard to get to know how to. This would be considered a dark pattern if it's made on purpose and it has negative experience for you without an explicit consent. In the context of games, it would be about making people do those microtransactions kind of against their will, or at least in a manipulative way. That means they will do it even though that's not really something they intended to initially. And that's why we're going to talk about ego depletion. So the ego depletion theory is that we have a certain amount of resources, emotional and cognitive, that are depleted after complex tasks. I think we can all relate to that. You've had a very big day at work. You do not have the mental capacity anymore or emotional capacity anymore to, I don't know, deal with specific problems that might be very taxing as well. You have a certain amount of resources and once it's riled up, you're in ego depletion. Ego depletion could lead to a decrease in self-control and willpower. What does that mean? Well, when we're tired, we have a higher tendency, for example, to get mad or to, I don't know, let's use another example, eat things that maybe we know are not very good for us. We don't really want to eat them, but we actually want to. We just know it's not great for us. We lack self-control. So this is ego depletion theory. And that means we have rather impulsive behavior. We might have more impulsive behavior when in ego depletion, when our resources are drained out for the day. And in this case, you see where I'm going with this. We maybe are more likely to make purchases and to not fight the status quo. We'll get to status quo right after. So ego depletion in video games would relate to players have an emotional and cognitive resource, a main that is being drained during the gameplay. So let's imagine it's a very enduring gameplay. And because of the ego depletion, it could lead them to agreeing to the status quo and lesser self-control, and maybe increase their acceptance in microtransaction in games. What is the status quo? Status quo is very simple. We have a natural bias towards accepting default options. For example, when is the last time you decided to stop a subscription that you don't need but doesn't really cost much to you? But do you really have the time to figure out a way to close it down when really it's not taking that much out of you? So this would be status quo. Unless you're sure you want to do something because of ego depletion, you're probably just going to let it smooth and keep running smoothly. So the timing of the microtransaction in this context makes a lot of sense and is very relevant. And if you understand this ego depletion theory and you look into microtransaction dark patterns, in this case, the dark pattern would be to put the microtransaction timing at a very specific point where you know that you're exploiting the psychological resource of the gamer. I hope this makes sense. What does that mean for ethical consideration? That means that understanding the player's cognitive function is crucial to avoid dark patterns and to avoid that we use it against the player. And dark patterns have implications for the player's experience and well-being in general, which makes it hyper relevant. I'm pretty sure we can evaluate dark patterns. And so now, going back to the question of how do we evaluate that, I'm pretty sure we could figure out this. Actually, we could probably quantify it. Talking about dark patterns and status quo bias, actually all of that blurs the line with gambling mechanisms, because remember I said that loot boxing is very random. It's based on randomness. And if you have this ego depletion, so you're drained out and you have a tendency to agree with status quo and maybe fight less your self-control, so have less self-control in general, you might have a tendency to buy more impulsively those kind of random things to hopefully have something good. And this looks a lot like gambling. I know that there are countries that are actually against loot boxes, and I think they have been, I'm not 100% sure, so double check this, but I think they have been cancelled in those countries from some games because of regulations, because they're against gambling in general. Double check that. I know it's a conversation, I'm not sure they did it entirely. So now we're going to talk about the big topic of mental health and games, and I know everyone has a lot of opinions about this one, and it would be addiction or internet gaming disorder. So internet gaming disorder is the way it's referred to in the DSM-5. DSM-5 is the Diagnosis Statistical Manual from the American Psychological Association. It's one of the two worldwide recognized diagnosis books for mental health disorders. And we'll talk about the other one later on the next slide. Internet gaming disorder is a substance-less addiction, and it is referred to in DSM-5, which is the latest version of the DSM, as a condition for further studies. Very important, it is not a full diagnosis. It is a condition for further studies as published in 2013. That means not enough research was done to adequately display which diagnosis criterion had to be taken in there. The gambling disorder and reward system activation is the main reason why this is considered as the next substance-less addiction. Only one other substance-less addiction exists, and that would be the gambling disorder. When you have a gambling disorder, you have a reward system that is activated in a similar way to drugs and substances. So that's why it has been considered an addiction for a little while, because same reward system works. And it induces comparable behavioral symptoms, very important. For example, and those are the main ones that we'll see also in IGD, it would be strong cravings, repeated unsuccessful efforts to reduce the behavior, and persistence despite negative consequences. Now, if we go to the internet gaming disorder, basically it would be an excessive online gaming behavior despite negative consequences, if we sum it up. Now, keep in mind that I'm talking about a diagnosis. So this is not enough to evaluate if someone has IGD, right? There is a full list that is being developed. There is research on it. It's a clinical diagnosis. We shouldn't use this term out of the blue to qualify anything that is not a mental disease, mental health disease even. So the idea is that IGD would have similar symptoms of activation, the reward system, and similar behavioral symptoms as in gambling disorder. That's what the DSM-5 status quo is. That's where they were at in 2013. And we'll see with the revised version if something else comes out. On the other hand, in 2018, the WHO, so World Health Organization, updated their ICD, which is also a diagnosis manual that is not dedicated to mental health, the ICD-11, with gaming disorder as a mental health disorder, and made it a recognized diagnosis in one of the two diagnosis books. Diagnosis criteria in the ICD that agree with what the DSM-5 says, because there are a lot of overlaps between both, would be loss of control over gaming, elevated priority placing on gaming activities, persistent inclination towards gaming despite negative repercussions, significant impairment or distress required for clinical diagnosis. Those are things that, or behaviors that you also see in gambling disorder, of course. And therefore that overlap between ICD and DSM-5. What are the positives of having this diagnosis created and clear enough, even though we'll discuss how it is being controversial in the literature right now and between researchers and clinical researchers? The positive of having a clear diagnosis for this is that gaming disorder can now be assessed. And if you can assess a trouble or a condition, that means you can support patients and you can give good care. That's very important because that's kind of the whole point of the caring system. Now, there's controversies about this. Keep in mind that the DSM-5 has mentioned it as one diagnosis that needs more research, while the ICD decided to put it out before having what seems like the adequate amount of research from the references I'll give to you right now. So the main questions we're having is in the details, and the devil always lies in the detail. A lot of misdiagnosis can happen because we don't understand yet if, or maybe some do, but at least from the literature I've read, it's unclear, when is it a coping mechanism that we overplay video games? When is it a symptom of another problem, so comorbidity? And when is it actually a disease on its own? And that's very important. When we talk about addiction, it has to be a standalone. Otherwise, it's just a coping mechanism, or it can be a consequence of something else, such as depression, loneliness, social anxiety, etc. So we need to make a big difference between addiction and problematic use. And that's something that in the general discourse, if you look at the news, usually is not very well done. That's why the term addiction is very misused. And the other question is it escapism or non-face-to-face social interaction that makes those games so attractive and make people play games more? Because non-face-to-face social interaction wouldn't be an issue in itself now if it leads to misuse, of course, overuse, of course. But again, we need to make a big difference between misuse, overuse, and gaming addiction. Very different. Second point is that the methods and scrutiny for those diagnoses are not well defined yet. As much as they should be, there is still a lot of unanswered questions, such as how do we define if it's a coping mechanism or a symptom of another condition? And finally, the prevalence of gaming disorder from 1998 to 2016 has apparently not increased if you take the current diagnosis points. So as much as we speak about it more and more, actually, it might just be a little bit of fear-mongering in there. And that's very interesting if you think about it, that it became such a big topic for a while. But if you take data, actually, it seems that the actual condition of gaming disorder was not more prevalent now, or is not more prevalent now than it was before. So what we need now is to fix the lack of clarity issue we have about the original and the official diagnosis. We need to look also at how this stigmatizes the players and the gamers, because it's not because people don't understand why you play games that it has to be an addiction. And that's also where the misuse of the term addiction is being done a lot. It's also unclear if the disorder is sometimes episodically, chronically, etc. And this is very important in diagnosis manuals to have this clarity on, does this have to occur just sometimes, by episodes, or all the time? And we need a proper definition and differentiation from coping mechanisms or comorbid disorders and the actual diagnosis. I hope this sheds some light for you on the gaming disorder or internet gaming disorders diagnosis, and that it is clear for you kind of what this addiction is. Now we're going to look into the overall well-being and how games are going to impact overall well-being or not, and then we'll take the questions about this second chapter of the presentation. So, potential positive impact of video games on well-being. As you can see, it's a picture from Animal Crossing, because that's a very happy game. And I know after talking about gloom things, it's always good to have a bit of light and color. So we have this now, this idea of potential positive impact of video games on well-being in general. And there has been some studies of that, of course, such as the one from Johannes et al. In 2021 about the measure of playtime as one of the data and how this will affect well-being on two games, Plant vs. Zombie and Animal Crossing. Both are not very violent and they're very cartoony. So the question was affective well-being and playtime. Affective well-being is the frequency and intensity of positive or negative emotions. What they saw is that there is a small positive relationship between gameplay and well-being. So that seemed cool. And the need for satisfaction, the need satisfaction and motivations during gameplay were independently related to well-being. Also, the fulfillment and gratification gained in the game positively impacted the gamer's mood, regardless of playtime. So all of that tells us that there are some very positive things about playing games. Now, Plant vs. Zombie is a cartoony game, but it is, I wouldn't call it a happy game like Animal Crossing. That's why they played both and they saw the same results for both games. A second study from 2021 by Wraith and collaborators about the positive impact on social well-being, so not just well-being, but well-being with the others in MMO games, so multiplayer games, said that it had a very positive impact on social well-being to play MMOs, and that was unrelated to the age or gaming habit of the participants. So it's not because you play games all the time or you're over 17 or under 17 that this impact will be any different. Also, talking about well-being, we can talk about meditation, mindfulness, and flow state. Flow state is a term we use a lot in video game psychology. Flow state is the complete focus on a task. I'm sure all of you have experienced it at some point. Sometimes referred to as being in the zone. And mindfulness is the same kind of being in the zone without the focus on the task. And actually, mindfulness can be reached with meditation, flow state as well, I'm pretty sure, or meditation can help you reach flow states. Anyway, all of this interacts with each other and is positive because flow states and mindfulness have impacts such as removing barriers of self-referential thinking. What does that mean? It means the vision you have of the world changes from your biased perspective to taking a step back on the situation, maybe understanding better what's around you, what's happening. That's very good for your cognitive process of computing things. Enjoyment, accomplishment, and meaningfulness and positive mood accompany flow states. That's a lot of very good things, but I'm sure all of you can relate to that. When you've spent so much time on a task, you didn't even realize time was flying by. That's also part of flow state. You lose the idea of time. And then you're just very happy. At least that happens to me all the time. When I write, especially, I guess it's one of those activities that put you in a very specific space in your mind. Now, when we talk about video games, some video games have been developed to help this journey. Is the one I would recommend the most. I love this game. And the same developers have done others like that are meant to help you in reaching flow state and improve your meditation skill and mindfulness skills. Because if you learn to put yourself in flow state, maybe it would be easier to put yourself in mindfulness, which is the same without the task. So if it induces flow state, it just promotes focusing and engagement within the game. And maybe that's a skill you can take outside of the game since it's a cognitive process you're learning. Also, final point about this, active video games and physical well-being. So we talked about general social well-being and well-being. We talked about meditation and flow state, and now we're going to talk about active video games and physical well-being. The study on interactive and technologically preoccupied children is very, sorry, I was reading the chat. So study on interactive and technologically preoccupied children. So here we have children that spend a lot of time playing games, basically, and they are inactive physically. Those were the population that was looked into. And some researchers made them play active video games on physical fitness. That would be, for example, if you remember the Wii that we used to have like 15 years ago or something, where you had like those little remotes that you could like play some tennis, some boxing, whatever this would be. Or then we had Wii Fit on which you could do like some step exercises. And now it goes so much further. Now you can do some bicycle in-house with a screen in a virtual environment. That would also qualify as a physical fitness video game. Bowling, I was so good at the bowling activity on the Wii. Terrible at everything else, but yes. So what they studied was this, and they wanted to see if it's going to impact their physical fitness of the children, reaction time, self-perception, enjoyment levels. That's quite important. Findings. Very cool findings. Active video games showed significant improvement in weight. So probably they lost a bit of weight. Body mass index, which is only a clinical referential. Important to keep in mind, BMI is not meant for anything but medical referential. Reaction times and self-perception. Reaction times and self-perception, well, reaction time is a cognitive skill. Self-perception is a social skill. But also cognitive social skill. Very important. Self-perception is also very much linked to your self-esteem. So children reported also to have very high enjoyment. And that means probably a will to play more. So this would be a virtuous cycle, as we call it. So we see benefits into those active games. And I hope it surprises no one that there is a lot of benefits in this. for example, to prevent obesity in childhood, which is a major issue in some countries, and to improve personal, social, and intellectual development. Here, I think my personal take on this is that if it can help someone feel better, especially a child, then it's worth it. And it seems to have this impact. And therefore raise self-esteem and enjoyment levels, which is awesome, because more self-esteem is just linked to a lot of more positive activities in the future as grown-ups, but also as children, and the way you grow into yourself. So it might actually be a very good alternative to sedentary video games. Just Dance is a very good example of an active video game. And also you can do it with friends online and in person, which make it social by design. And it's very, very awesome. So you could get all the goods of games just by playing this. So the conclusion about mental health and the mental health discussion is that gaming disorder and internet gaming disorder diagnosis are still being discussed. And the veracity of the current diagnosis is being discussed as well, and a bit controversial. And we're not saying video game or gaming disorder doesn't exist. We're just saying we need to define it properly and not use the term addiction every time we see misuse. And I'm very strong about this. I feel very strongly about this because I've seen so many people telling me, oh no, but he has gaming addiction, she has gaming disorder. And it was just very much, I don't know, like, are you a psychiatrist being able to evaluate this based on diagnosis manual? I'm not saying it doesn't exist, just saying we need to be very clear about what we're talking about. We wouldn't do that with any other disease. There is a need for proper assessment and proper tools to accurately identify and address those gaming-related issues. And the misunderstanding of the condition itself by the public can lead to harm and stigmatization of gamers. And this is what we really want to fight against. Not discriminate people, stigmatize people because of an activity they like. What I usually tell parents that ask this question is, if they were playing football, soccer, the same way they're playing video games, would you have the same reaction? If the answer is yes, then okay, go to a psychiatrist, go to a psychologist, get a diagnosis. If the answer is no, then maybe it's just the perception we have of gaming, right? Also, there's a study that came out not too long ago in France. I don't have the reference in here, I'm sorry about that. That's looked into screen time and to see if screen time can mean everything and nothing, right? But take it like that, if that was the issue. And one of the conclusions was to say the problem is not the screen time or the time we spent behind the screen, but rather the time we spent not doing anything else. So maybe that's where we want to start. When it comes to video game disorder, but also video game use. Are we sacrificing too much of the rest to play video games? And how would we react if it was anything else? Exactly, balance. It's always a question of balance, right? Now, video games can also be super cool for well-being, and we like that, whether it is for just overall well-being, also meditation, we've seen that, or meditation-like skills, and physical well-being. So that is a very good thing to know. Again, it always depends. Everything depends. We're in ethics. And now we can take 5 minutes before we go into the last part of this presentation to answer a couple of questions. I've seen a lot, so I'll go back. Sergen, I hope I answered some of your questions about compulsive purchasing and from kids. That's actually a good point I didn't raise here, the difference between kids and non-kids in dark patterns. In general, if you're asking for my advice, it's just children should not have access to, until before a certain age, to spending money online without a cord. It's the same way in a shop, they wouldn't unless their parents was with them, or if it's their own money. But that's another question. AI-based nudging activity in the background. Very good question. AI-based nudging activity. So the regulation on AI is coming up, and actually this will be addressed as well in it. So the nudging aspect will be addressed, especially based on vulnerable population needs, which is children, for example. And in general, parents should get involved into what their kids are playing on. How can we measure the transposition of skills? I think I answered that already. education tools to avoid negative impact of those dark patterns. Education definitely is a big part of it, being aware that when you're tired, when you've played for long hours, when you just back from work and you start playing, back from your day you start playing, you might have less self-control. And so being very aware of it and putting it in practice, you know, thinking, okay, do I really want that? Or is it just because I'm tired and I'm saying yes? I think that's already a very good start. Usually acknowledging the bias helps you fight the bias. Free Android games that could negatively influence kids mentally by shaping their vision about, for instance, what a predator. Again, that's what we're going to talk about so in the third part. So I'm not going to answer this question now. It's interesting you say, okay, sorry, there's a conversation between the two of you. The DSM-5 must be used as a tool, not as law. You're very right. There's also the ICD-11, but I think that both tools together actually are quite complete. So many systematic issues in healthcare because of certain diagnoses, you're right. How they are assessed and the possible negative effects they may have on people on societal level, you're very right. You're very right. Now the question is always, do we have anything better? And if you take the ICD and the DSM together, I'm not sure we have anything better to diagnose mental health disease. And a lot of people are working to improve both of those. I'm not saying it's perfect at all. I'm saying we just need to do with what we have and try to improve it as best as possible. Okay. Has flow state anything to do with the flow theory? Yes, it definitely has, Thierry. Flow state and flow theory are intertwined. So the way you put yourself in that, or your brain goes into that state, is the flow state theory, the flow theory.
Okay, we have 15 minutes, if we can.
We have 15.
15 minutes.
No, we have 30 more minutes, I think.
34?
30,
okay.
Yeah. And please, what is your point of view about meeting websites that use dark patterns and bebop programming? I guess programming, is that what you meant? I think dark patterns in general are just something that should be banned, but I'm very strong about the dark pattern questions. I think dark patterns should just not be allowed if we're able to recognize there are dark patterns. And I think actually in the latest regulation, in Europe, in the EU, what's its name? Anyway, there's a latest regulation that is not about AI, but about Digital Service Act. There you go. There is something about dark patterns in there. So actually this might already have been addressed by regulations. Okay, now let's go to video games and social behavior. So moral decision-making in games. That's a first step we need to understand, because when we talk about social behavior, we also talk about adequate social behavior. And a lot of it comes from values, morality, blah, blah, about the general community, about your environment, about what is adequate, what is not. Moral decision-making in games also is very important because it will relate to all of that. First, how do we make moral decisions? Haidt's moral decision, moral intuitionism model gives us a few hints. There is different visions, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're going with the intuitionism model. You'll see why right after. According to this model, we have an intuition or gut feeling that comes first before we actually state a judgment. And it's followed by slow moral reasoning. So basically, I see something that I dislike. I decide I dislike it because my gut feeling tells me, I dislike it. Later on, I will have a low process. If someone asks me, but why do you dislike it? Then I'll do something about it. Or I'll figure out a reason. That's the theory. Social moral judgments would therefore be based on feelings and autobiographical beliefs taught by culture and environment. I'm raised in a certain environment that will give me a certain amount of rules, certain amount of visions about things, and this would be my social moral judgments basis. And then I also have the reflection on my beliefs. So I can change those, of course, even though it requests for a bit of work. The reflection on beliefs through perspective taken actually is a very good way to change my own beliefs. And perspective taking is literally putting myself in someone else's shoes cognitively. We'll get back to this definition right after. And it can lead me to changing my own beliefs when I reason with this new data, with this new perception I have. And especially when it conflicts with my intuition. And I'm sure all of us have something that comes to mind about an experience we had where we thought something, we had a feeling about something. And then when cognitively thinking about it, trying to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, well, actually we realized maybe our gut feeling was not so right. Maybe it was wrong. And maybe our belief about a specific group of people, specific type of individuals actually are not so right. Religion, yes, but any part of culture. So religion is a big one, you're right. But culture in general. So how does that relate to empathy? Empathy is an innate capacity, important point, that allows individuals to comprehend and share the thoughts and emotions of others. So it has different layers: emotional, motivational, cognitive. The first layer I would say is probably the cognitive one. It's the one where you put yourself in someone else's shoes and you realize what's happening. The second would be emotional, where now you cognitively know what's happening, but you're also feeling it. And this happens mostly, probably, let's say probably, because it very much depends, but probably with close friends or people that are close to you. If you see someone crying, someone you really like, you really appreciate crying, you might actually get into this emotional empathy. And motivational empathy is the next step after that, which is doing things to make people feel good or bad or something. So you're projecting yourself into how people will feel and create behavior to make them feel a certain way. I hope this is clear. And the one we're going to focus on when it comes to video games is cognitive perspective taking, so cognitive empathy. And it may play a role in shaping morals, behavior, and reasoning, like Haidt stated earlier. Because if you take someone's perspective, even just cognitively, without feeling their emotions, but rather just thinking about what they could be feeling, well, then it might change your perception on the world, your perception on them. In video game world, it's called identification. You identify with the avatar to a certain point, and therefore the experience of the avatar would become your experience. To a certain point, again, that's why we're talking only about cognitive empathy here. I'm sure emotional empathy could also be considered part of this, but let's keep to cognitive empathy and perspective taking. And we also have a second theory in the video game science, which is the Proteus effect about behavioral conformity. So I would conform the behavior of my avatar to my behavior, which means, or the other way around, which means the morals I have will impact my avatar's behavior, but the morals of my avatar will impact me as well. You see what I mean? So this identification could have a moral impact. And this effect in general, what you learn through your avatar's eyes, seem to last beyond your gaming experience. It's a very important point as well. Peña and collaborators' research was about border control. Anyway, very cool experiment. If you want to look at it, the game is also available. The game they used is Papers, Please. Very interesting game if you want to play it. So now we understand how perspective taking can take a step in our moral decision making, but also change maybe our beliefs. And the impact of moral decision making in video games is therefore one we have to consider. Perspective taking in video games can have an impact on the player's attitude and behavior in real life. That's the statement we start with. Maybe it can motivate pro-social behaviors. Actually, that is a very valid point as well. And positive behaviors towards others. For example, I take the perspective of a group that is usually discriminated, or I usually discriminate. against, and by playing them, I might actually develop some understanding of this group, of this culture, or else, and therefore reduce my bias against them, or change my bias against them. Very important. Taking someone's perspective can also add to my library of knowledge, and that's where the change can happen. It's because if I'm learning more, have more data to make my decisions and to review my past decisions. So video games have the potential, most proudly, to shape moral decision-making and behaviors with implications for your own personal growth and growth of knowledge and societal impact as a whole in general. That's a big statement. That's also a lot of studies that happened on this. So the impact of video game-based empathy on morality. First, we're going to start back with the identification idea. And Smiley in 2008 did a study with book characters and the identification people had with book characters and the morality in those books. A first interesting point is that readers who identified with the suffering characters, yes, Smiley is a really sweet name. So readers who identified with the suffering characters tend to change their moral judgment regarding social injustices. Again, I'm pretty sure all of us have a book that really impacted us because we identified with the character, maybe because the story was very specific. One that is used a lot in at least my generation would be Harry Potter. I mean, I'm not I wouldn't probably identify with Harry Potter himself, but I could potentially identify with other characters in that book. And especially if the character you identify with is being discriminated against, being unjustly treated, actually that might change your perception of the group this character belongs to. And this perspective taking works in groups, which means it might very much work in games. Toussignan and collaborators also looked into perspective taking from a neuroscientific perspective and said that perspective taking in games would allow individuals to feel the negative emotions of peers, which is why we would identify most and even change our moral judgments about specific people if we experience through identification something negative due to identifying with someone from this group. If that makes sense, I hope it does. And therefore that would motivate people's behavioral change. And hopefully in an ideal society, reduce bias and prejudice. In any case, enhance personal growth. There's a study on Red Dead Redemption 2 that tested this hypothesis about video game-based empathy, and if we actually have more empathy for people that are being harmed, and their answer is yes, basically, that characters that relate to morality in harmful situations, moral decisions. So we have a higher empathy in games for characters that are going through something morally harmful. And that might impact our decision-making in games and therefore our general decision-making, blah, blah. Therefore, negative emotional situations in game can lead to higher empathy for characters and stronger effects on moral deliberation decision in games. Another example is a study I did with my ex-supervisor, Dean McDonald, where we checked morality and emotional, we checked how video games could change decision-making about specific groups, in this case, androids, and we looked into Detroit Become Humans. And actually the perspective-taking experience did show to influence the perception of androids and AI in general of the gamers on the short term. Important to say, we didn't check it 6 months later, but that would have been interesting. So this perspective-taking approach did at least make sense in our study. And we replicated it and it still works. So hopefully that was a good finding. Now, the role of personal morality in video games decision, you're gonna ask me, because we have our own personal morality and maybe our decisions in game will be impacted by it, hopefully even. Especially if you look into narrative video games where the decisions are very important for the story in general. when you have immoral content or actions in video games, it can lead to make you reflect on your own moral deliberations, as we've seen until now. So it makes you rethink your beliefs. It might make you rethink some ideas you already pre-have. I think you understood that now. Technological advancement in graphics and social features actually enhance the interactivity and the immersion of the video games. Important point as well. So on top of having this perspective taking, you might have this social aspect where you feel like you are present in the game. And this feeling of social and self-presence in the game can increase players' connection to moral dilemmas, so also emotional involvement in those moral dilemmas, and influence the decisions consistent with personal values and beliefs. Personal morality and decision-making. So now you're in your game, and you have your personal morality coming in. And it plays a big role in the decisions you make. Or if you look back into the Proteus effect that I mentioned, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you want to act like your character, and therefore you apply the morality of your character. That's a second view on this. But it's not, let's say it's not fighting views, it's rather completing views. But let's imagine this doesn't apply so much and it's your personal morality you want to put in there. There are people who researched how we identify the motivations for playing morally challenging video games. Because why would we do it knowing that we're putting ourselves in a socially present state that might make us uncomfortable, cognitively speaking? And actually, it's very cool. The answers were first escapism, because it's actually very nice to play a more challenging game. Usually they're very good narrative games. And also, interestingly, that was one of their first reasons to not follow their own personal morality. So escapism is, I'm going to play like I'm not me. I'm going to experience something else. I'm going to experience other moralities. Exploration also was the reason why. And so involves experimentation. I don't know if you've played those narrative games, but usually you replay them more than once. Just to, first time you do it like a real you, and then you try different things to see what would have happened. That's exploration. And then multiple playthrough, which is the thing I just mentioned. So in general, we see that as much as personal morality can be applied in here, well, it doesn't have to. So why is it important to understand video games morality? So how we make our decisions in game, how it might impact us, etc. Because playing morally challenging video games can help us understand how games can help us reflect on our moral codes, but also maybe reinforce or de-enforce them. And I think that also is a social learning tool then. And video games can contribute to the formation of an individual's moral values, the same way books can, the same way movies can. But the impact may vary based on the player's motivation and engagement level. Going back to this, if I'm playing just for escapism, the impact of my moral decisions in games are not going to be so big, probably. But if I'm playing really because I want to be here, I'm in a situational motivation, I really want to play that game, then the impact may be different. I'm going to go very quickly because I see the time running into two big topics, violence and aggressive behavior, just to give you answers about those. And the second one is sexual objectification of female in games. And then we'll get to the final Q&A. So the violence question is basically, there is a debate about video games making people violent. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. And this stems from the social learning theory from Bandura, saying that by observing and reinforcing aggressive behaviors, in this case in video games, we could lead to an increased aggression in everyday life. Bandura, from any psychologist out here, anyone studying psychology, you're aware of his theories. So the arguments that are saying that video games, violent video games, have a bad impact would be, for example, the study, from Gentle and Gentle about playing violent video games with approved and rewarded in-game violence, which is usually the case in violent video games, could lead to increased aggression in players. That's what Gentill and Gentill studied in 2008. We also have a meta-analysis from 2014 that provides similar evidence. Even though the effects didn't seem so big, there is evidence there, but also a direct counter kind of to this that is about methodological approaches. And I think that's the main topic we'll view in this kind of research, is the problem of your paper says it, but that does not mean the methodology applied was appropriate. That does not mean the data were not modified. There has been a big debate about this and also a big backlash for one of the main researchers on this kind of topic, that we realized, or rather the community realized, his data has been falsified for a few years. So we know that this is a realm in which it's so political that we also have a lot of bad science, if I can say, and unethical science happening in there, especially in the interpretation of data and which data are being collected. And finally, the publication bias that all academics would have heard of, especially experimental-based academics, that only the studies showing effects are actually published or were actually published. In psychology, that's a big issue we're having. So now we have some kind of countermeasures where we can pre-register our studies before we have the outcome of the study, and they are accepted prior to the data collection and analysis. So the methodology is what sells a paper now, rather than if there is an effect or not, because no effect is an answer. No effect is a knowledge. So the publication bias, however, might have had a big impact on those publications, saying, well, if you publish only papers with an effect, indeed, you're going to have only papers saying that video games make people violent, rather than, oh, no, it doesn't, because those papers wouldn't be published. I hope this is clear. Final point, most of the papers were evaluating short-term effects, not long-term effects, short-term effects. Therefore, it's a bit hard to generalize a short-term effect. So, weak statistical link, problem with the methodology, and a recent meta-analysis found in general, so 2022, found that there is negligible relationships between violent games and aggressive or pro-social behavior. So it's not even just about the positive, it's also about, or negative, it's also about the positive. Meta-analysis says, you know, there doesn't seem to be very much there. However, when we talk about violence, we can talk about the desensitization that does seem to be very much there. And this relationship seems to be very stronger. So maybe we can get desensitized to violence through playing violent video games. I would say this wouldn't be surprising, also considering this could be said the same for movies, for example. And research suggests that competition within games and specific game features like frustration levels and pace of action may impact aggressive behavior. Again, here we're talking about short-term effect, but still very interesting. So we're not saying games don't make people violent. We just say it's not that well proven. Maybe it's not the violence in the game. Maybe it's the mechanics that we were mentioning at the very beginning of this presentation. Maybe also the effects are only short-term, the same way when you get frustrated because you lost a volleyball game, you would get frustrated when you lose a level game. Anyway, it's very unclear. In general, we have unsettled debate and a need for further research in this area. And some argue for a negative effect, while others highlight the weak statistical relationships. And further research with reproducible design and controls are variable. Now, finishing up on the sexualization and violence towards female characters and towards actual females. Objectification theory says if you're exposed to sexually objectified things in the media, it can lead to self-objectification in women and objectification of women. Self-objectification is not good because it can reduce the value you give to your competence, to give more to your appearance, thinking about appearance from others' perspective. So you always think about what someone else is thinking about you, and you treat your body as a representation of yourself, of the self, the entire self. So you're only your body. There are some research saying that the correlation research say that women who engage in self-objectification are more likely to objectify other women, contributing to the cultural occurrence of sexualization. That is unrelated to video games, it's just in general. And individuals who sexually objectify women tend to hold negative attitudes. That means behaviors, thoughts, etc., and perceive women as less competent. Misogyny kind of stems from this idea, probably. Now, if we look into video games, Beck and Rose did a study with GTA. I think it was the 5th. Anyway, and they evaluated if seeing and being kind of actor of violence against female characters in this very realistic video game would change or have an impact on the perception people have of women, especially the rape myth theory. So the idea that the rape myth evaluation is a scale that also gives us violence towards women and value of women kind of evaluation of people. Basically what they saw is very mixed, because right after the experiment on the short term, they didn't really have an effect, but on the long term, 6 months later, they actually saw that people had a tendency to have a better vision of women in the sense of believing less in the rape theory, in the rape myth, than prior, if that makes sense. So actually being part of a traumatic event for the female character, or looking at it, actually had an impact, but on the positive sense rather than the negative one. That's why we say it's a complex impact on the attitude towards women. I'm gonna go over this. Just in general, the conclusion is that for this, the relationship is very complex and nuanced. I cannot tell you that having sexualized, objectified women in games actually impacts how people behave towards women. It's very unsure based on the data, but it doesn't mean we should keep doing it like that. And that's just general ethics to say maybe there's a societal need to improve the representation of women and female characters in games, just for the sake of it, even if it's just for the sake of it, because representation is important. General conclusion, video games ethics needs everyone's perspective, multidisciplinarity, and it has, in general, a very big potential. And that's what we're seeing with development of actions for video games ethics, which is very good. Video games are very cool. They can enhance your cognitive and social skills. There are still a lot of debates that we still need more research on about the positive impact, even though we've seen there is some very cool impacts. We've seen also some very cool things about mindfulness, teaching opportunities, improving overall well-being and well-being behaviors. We also know that there is a potential for negative impacts such as violence, addiction, manipulative design practices, the dark patterns. And we know that there is a relationship between real-life attitude in general, or might be in the moral decision-making, but we do not have a strong proof that violence and sexism actually stem from video game practice. And some studies suggest a link between violent video games and real-life aggression, but as we've seen, it's a weak relationship, and the exposure to sexual objectification seems to not really impact the way people see women, but representation improvement is still a very good step to take. So moving forward, we need more research, a more open dialogue with less closed doors about it, responsible game design, and balancing the potential benefits and risks to reach an ethical word. There you go. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Auxane. Can you mute your microphone when I speak?
Sure.
Yes.
Wait, I'm not sure where to do that. Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. And I see, so we are close to the end of the time, but we can maybe take some questions in the chat and have one or two more live, if possible. So you can mute and answer maybe about not there is a discussion about diversity in the development team, and I would add access to the development team. To what extent can you have access to the companies developing games, for example?
Yes, so there is definitely a big need in having more diversity. That's very true. Wait, I'm gonna just stop sharing my screen. Yeah, so I think there's definitely a need for more women representation in developing teams. That's 100% true. Because in general, we know that having more diversity, and it's not just women, it's any type of diversity. We know that we have an issue with that in the development teams of video games. The more you have representation in the group that creates something, the less bias you have, because biases kind of interact with each other and people are able to point them out and do something best in the end, or better. That's the same question we have in AI. And women are definitely one of the populations that is underrepresented, even though it's a very big population if you think about it. I hope that answers. About the references, Maya, just reach out to me right after and I'll send you a list.
Yes. Can we have access to the slides afterwards?
Yeah, I can send you the slides afterwards. Yeah.
Okay. And about having access to the companies developing games?
So for us on our side, it depends. There are some companies that we do interact with and we do reach out to and we do discuss with. So I can tell you, but usually there are smaller companies, even though Quantic Dreams, which is a very big one in France that did, for example, Detroit Become Human, has had big interest in what we're doing. I would say for now, it's still at the very beginning of seeing this as an issue and discussing this ethics within the games, not just within the business ethics. So, because we've had also Gamersgate, I didn't mention all the social aspects of gaming and the gaming culture in here, but yeah, with Gamergates and all the big topics that Blizzard and other big companies, Ubisoft as well, had issues with sexual harassment claims in the past few years. There is more and more need as well that they see to avoid the backlash and the reputational costs, to be more ethical within their doings in the culture, and then be more ethical within the games, because actually at some point that's what's going to sell more. The return on invest of ethical games is actually very good. That's why a lot of independent games still survive, even though they're very independent.
I don't see any other questions in chat. And I think we have reached the end of the time. But thank you again. It was very interesting and different from the talks we have usually. And it's a nice connection between ethics, data science, and games in this occasion. So thank you very much. I think people can contact you directly if they want more information about the references and so on. And so yes, thanks again, and see you soon, maybe in Paris.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.